The history of our story began long ago. At one point in time, around 3 billion years ago, we were floating around as little tiny atoms in the little petri dish of the world. Fast forward to around 6 million years ago, and we see the emergence of the first hominids, the family of primates that include humans. 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus was the first species to leave Africa and colonize other parts of the world. They had larger brains than their primate ancestors. Around 400,000 years ago, the first evidence of the Neanderthals. Their bodies were adapted to the cold environments of Europe and Western Asia. Their distinctive facial features were some of the most human-like ever seen. Then came us, the only surviving species of the Homo genus. But how did Homo sapiens rise into a global dominance through the mechanism of civilization? We begin our story in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in 4000 BCE. Nestled between the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers in the Sumerian city of Uruk. Instead of relying on hunting and gathering like our ancestors of the past, the citizens of Uruk were able to develop a way to harvest cereal grains like wheat and barley. However, turning cereal grains into edible foods took a lot of work. In the beginning, they had to use an invention called a hand mill, which consisted of 2 stones. As the grains were crushed between the 2 stones, the flour was collected in a container and stored for future use. This was the start of something great. This complex, strenuous process was our modern world's first example of agriculture. We no longer depended on hunting animals or picking berries for our food. Rather than using human ingenuity, we can create our own food source. This allowed Uruk to prosper into a place with over 50,000 residents. However, this change did have a change on the human body. The average height of men drastically shrunk from 5'9" to 5'3", and for women they shrunk on average from 5'3" to 5 feet. Instead of being the super athletes we were of the past, we were smaller, less noticeable farmers. People also became landlocked, changing the very essence of what it means to be human. In the early 3000 BCE, according to legend, King Gilgamesh began his rule as a Sumerian king of his region. One of the world's earliest poems, the Epic of Gilgamesh, describes the story of Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality. He meets a wise traveler named Utnapishtim, who tells a story of a great flood sent to destroy the world. Towards the poem's end, Gilgamesh says, "Life which you look for, you will never find. For when gods created man, they let death be his share, and life withheld in their own hands." However, by the end of 3000 BCE, the Akkadians ousted the Sumerians. Sargon the Great took power and conquered all of Sumeria. While in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan, a new civilization was growing. The Indus Valley civilization, 3300 to 1300 BCE, was most notable for its highly advanced toilet system. The toilets were built with a seat and a chute that led to the underground drainage system. The sewage was then carried away from the homes through a network of covered drains, preventing disease spread. The waste was treated and disposed outside of city limits, helping to keep the cities clean and hygienic. While in Egypt, they were more consumed with building pyramids than basic human plumbing. This was because, in ancient Egyptian religion, it was believed that when a pharaoh was to die in the physical world, his spirit would continue to live on in the afterlife, in which they would continue to rule in perpetuity, and where they would be worshipped by the living. Inside these pyramids, the pharaoh's body was carefully mummified, a process believed to preserve his physical form and help ensure his spirit's journey to the afterlife. The pyramid was also filled with offerings and treasures intended to provide the pharaoh with the resources he would need in the afterlife. Every pharaoh wanted to make sure they were immortal. They wanted to succeed in the afterlife. They wanted to be worshipped forever. That's why it was an utmost priority for Egyptian pharaohs to build pyramids for themselves when laid to rest. It started when Pharaoh Djoser, 2667 to 2648 BCE, built the Step Pyramid at Saqqara, followed by Sneferu, 2613 to 2589 BCE, who built several pyramids, such as the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. Then came the pharaoh Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BCE, who built the famous Great Pyramid of Giza in a labor-intensive 20-year process, one that the world still marvels at today. Khufu was then followed by pharaohs Khafre and Menkaure, who built the slightly smaller second and third pyramids of Giza respectively. While over in China in the year 2100 BCE, the first Chinese dynasty was upon us. Like the people of Mesopotamia, the Chinese were ever reliant on agriculture, producing rice, wheat, and barley among other crops. However, as legend has it, the Yellow River flooded. These massive floods would destroy all the crops, leading to massive famine and suffering. However, not all was to be lost because Yu the Great was on his way. Yu was so distraught by this problem that he would spend his days traveling up and down the Yellow River. He found ways to divert the rivers by building levees and dikes so that he could regulate the waterways. Then, after 13 years of hard work, the floods could no longer wreak havoc on the land. The people were overjoyed, and Yu was hailed as a savior. That was the start of the first Chinese dynasty, the Jia dynasty. Though the accuracy of this tale is questioned by historians, it does establish an important precedent. The idea is that power ought to follow one's merit. An individual who deserves absolute power shall have absolute power. This idea would shape the world for years to come and cause the people of ancient China to follow him to create the first ever Chinese dynasty. While back over in Mesopotamia, around 1772 BCE, a Babylonian king named King Hammurabi created the basis of the legal system as we know it today. Hammurabi ordered the creation of a 7-foot-tall, 2-foot-wide stone slab. Written on it was a system of 282 laws that each citizen of his kingdom was to follow. Such laws included various laws such as Law 1. If a man brings an accusation against another man, charging him with murder but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Law 197 says, if he breaks another man's bone, they shall break it. Law 199. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave or breaks the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 his price. However, what King Hammurabi did was create a society based on laws. He laid out strict laws, placing people into certain castes of life and value. Everyone was worth a different amount based on what class they were in society. There was no illusion of equality in ancient Babylon. Instead, it was pretty clear the value of a noble's bone was worth more than a plebeian's, which in turn was worth more than a slave's. An idea we continue to see throughout history. While in modern-day Turkey, a lesser-known civilization came to power. The Hittite Empire under the charismatic rule of the leader Labarnus, 1680 to 1650 BCE. He was a skilled ruler with a single vision in mind, uniting the Hittite city-states under a single rule. Labarnus led his army from city to city, conquering neighboring city-states and making alliances with their leaders. He was a shrewd diplomat, and he used his diplomatic skills to win over the hearts and minds of the people. Eventually, Labarnus became the ruler of all the Hittite city-states and established the empire. He was a just and fair ruler and was loved by his people. Under his rule, the Hittites prospered and their territory expanded, leaving them right next to their neighbors in Egypt. Right after the writing of the Communist Manifesto began a period in Europe known as the Scramble for Africa. It all began in the 1870s when European countries began to explore the interior of Africa, looking for new territories to claim and resources to exploit. At first, the European powers were cautious, sending explorers and missionaries into Africa to establish trade networks and alliances with local leaders. However, as competition increased, the European powers became more aggressive in their tactics. They used military force to establish colonies and protectorates, and they engaged in diplomatic maneuvering and propaganda campaigns to gain the support of local populations. One of the most ruthless tactics the European powers used was dividing Africa into artificial borders and creating new ethnic and linguistic divisions. This created tensions and conflicts between different African groups, which the Europeans used to their advantage, creating a European stronghold over the continent of Africa to increase their profits. The scramble for Africa came to an end as a result of several factors, including changing international politics, economic realities, and rising African nationalism. One of the key factors that contributed to the end of the scramble for Africa was the changing balance of power in Europe. By the early 20th century, European powers were increasingly focused on competition with each other, particularly in Europe itself, and were less interested in acquiring new colonies in Africa. This was due in part to the growing tensions between European powers that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. Because on June 28, 1914, a shot was heard around the world with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his assassination by a Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip sparked a diplomatic crisis that quickly escalated into a global conflict. In the aftermath of the assassination, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, triggering a complex web of alliances and treaties that drew other countries into the conflict. Germany, an ally of Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia and France, while Great Britain, which had a treaty with Belgium, declared war on Germany. Within weeks, most of Europe was embroiled in a brutal and devastating conflict. In November 1918, after 4 years of brutal fighting, the Allied powers and the Central Powers agreed to an armistice, effectively bringing an end to the war and the demise of the Ottoman Empire. On November 11th, the armistice went into effect, and the guns fell silent across Europe. World War II. The peace was short-lived because a man named Adolf Hitler invaded Poland. Like Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Trajan, Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Suleiman the Great, Adolf Hitler wanted to establish an empire for his nation and his people. Adolf had dreams of building an empire larger than anything that was ever created. He wanted to make the Roman Empire look like nothing. However, for the sake of the world, and especially those Hitler viewed as undesirable vermin, in April 1945, Soviet forces began a massive assault on Berlin. After weeks of intense fighting, the city fell on May 2nd, and German forces surrendered. Meanwhile, Allied forces were closing in from the west, and on May 7th, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, officially ending the war in Europe. A few months later, after the bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan surrendered as well, leaving the war to be over. From World War II on, the world has faced a technological revolution. With Alan Turing's invention of the computer during the war, the world became global. For 50 years, America and the Soviet Union were at war, despite the fact that they were on two totally different continents. In 1969, Neil Armstrong landed on the moon, saying,
"That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
As the years on the world has become increasingly smaller, computers have become more affordable. Cell phones changed the way we communicated with one another. Let's go back to the story of a man named Gilgamesh on his quest for immortality. At the end of the poem, Gilgamesh realizes, life, which you look for, you will never find. For when gods created man, they let death be his share, and life withheld in their own hands. The history of human civilizations is an incomplete book, constantly being updated. Some things will never change. However, humans will always die. Empires will always rise and fall. The masses will always clamor towards safety.